Hi, so today we will look at the 7 basic exercise categories used in high intensity functional training, functional fitness, CrossFit, whatever. I will do this video presentation in English since we have trainers from Hamburg and we also have English speaking trainers here in Denmark. So the exercise categories is a simple way to look at the exercises we do in our sport from a movement pattern perspective. And even though there are hundreds, if not thousands of exercises, almost all of the exercises we do can be put into either one of these categories or a combination of 2 or more of the categories. So the whole point about speaking about these exercise categories is because it's a very good base and foundation to understand the movements we do and to be able to instruct better and be better at correcting people as trainers. And oftentimes we worry a lot about the very small specific movements that are within the exercises, like the rotational angle and position of the shoulder in the overhead squat or the snatch, the way the knee travels in the deep squats. But also from the purpose of these videos, it's a good start to start with the very basics, which are these 7 exercise categories. And just to make things clear, I'm not saying that these 7 movement patterns or these 7 movements are the only movements being done in high intensity functional training. There are exercises that involves other movements in these big joints like the shoulder, the hips, knees and the ankles, and the spine for that matter. But I think these deserve to be in the basic movement categories in high intensity functional training. So today we will have a look at the lower body dominant movements. We will look at the hip dominant movements and knee dominant movements, and we will try to define what they mean, and we will look at similarities and differences in different exercises and sometimes where these two even overlap. So when is an exercise hip dominant and when is an exercise knee dominant? Well, there aren't really any clear consensus about when it's one or the other. But first, to understand it, we can look at the similarities between these 2 lower body dominant movements. With both a knee and a hip dominant movement, there's going to be a resistance against a knee extension and a hip extension. So, for example, in an air squat, you have to simultaneously extend the knees and the hips against a resistance, which here is the gravity and your own body weight. So that's why it's actually, instead of making 2 categories when we really want to dig into this topic, it's actually better to draw a kind of a spectrum that goes from that an exercise can be very knee dominant or exclusively knee dominant, and the other end of the spectrum we have when exercises are exclusively hip dominant. So in this area, we can talk about, for example, GHD hip extensions, which is an exclusively hip dominant movement. There is no resistance against knee extension because the knees are straight. There is only a resistance against the hip extensions from a flex position. At the other end of the spectrum, we can talk about an exercise like that we don't really use a lot in high intensity functional training, but we can use it for assistance exercise, is, for example, a sissy squat, which is actually you try to keep the knees straight or as straight as you can, and then you squat down, bending the knees from a weight-bearing position while actually leaning the upper body backwards. So that is a almost exclusively knee dominant movement. There's a lot of demands and recruitment of the quads, almost no recruitment of the hamstring and the glutes. The other end of the spectrum, GHD hip extension, no recruitment of the quads really, but major recruitment of the hamstring and the glutes. So in a WOD setting in functional fitness or high intensity training, we very rarely use exercises that are exclusively hip dominant or exclusively knee dominant. Usually it's in this middle part of the spectrum. So like you can choose to do deadlifts or power clean from a very hip dominant perspective. It kind of is dependent on the workout. There's a lot of other exercises that are very knee dominant. Some choose, if there's a deadlift in the workout, to do it very hip dominant instead. So in this end of the spectrum, you have kind of the Romanian deadlift type style where you use a lot the hamstring and the glutes, and there isn't a lot of demands for the quads, for example. So you can see a lot of resistance against knee extension from a very flexed position, not a lot of resistance against hip extension. Then you can kind of move to the knee dominant aspect of the spectrum, like a conventional deadlift is usually a little more knee dominant. If you go to the way most people perform low bar back squat, it becomes a bit more knee dominant. To the high bar back squat, which requires often a bit more of a knee travel and resistance against knee extension, and to a front squat goblet squat type style. And then again, it's very dependent on the individual. That there are actually people, for myself, for example, which are not flexible and don't have the anthropometrics, the length of the limbs that are required to be able to squat in this manner at all. So for some, the exercises in CrossFit never become more knee dominant than this, because the way their mobility and their anatomy is requiring them to having to perform the exercises to a more hip dominant style. But for some others who are very knee dominant, very flexible, have long torsos and shorter legs, they can perform the exercises a lot more knee dominant. For example, sometimes you see with a wall ball where you can hold the ball a bit out in front of you, it makes it easier to almost, for some, lean back a bit and make the exercise very quad and knee dominant, which is oftentimes a big advantage. Really quickly talking about unilateral movement, which means one-legged lower body exercises. It is exactly the same rules that apply. An exercise can either be more hip dominant unilateral movement or a more knee dominant unilateral movement. So for example, we have here a more Romanian type style single leg deadlift, where there is another leg, but we're not worrying about that because that's not the training leg. So on the training leg, the front leg, you have very much resistance against hip extension compared or relative to the resistance against the knee extension. That means very hip dominant unilateral lower body exercise. You can see here more a little more knee dominant style single-legged deadlift. If you go over to a box step up, you can see here there is a bit more. It's more a choice to make it more hip dominant, because this person is leaning their upper body forward more. That means more resistance against hip extensions, choosing a more hip dominant style. But you can also choose to do a step up with a very knee dominant style. And the same goes for Bulgarian split squats and lunges. The amount of hip flexion you choose to use relative to the amount of knee flexion is what determines how hip or knee dominant the lunge or the split squat is. And then you can see this end of the spectrum if you have a person, again, like the example with the wall ball before, where the person is very flexible in the ankles and has a short legs and a longer torso. They can perform a pistol, for example, very, very effectively. So that's why you see in the CrossFit Games, for example, you can see the ones that are best at pistol are often the shorter athletes with very flexible ankles, because they can have a very fast circle time of pistols, for example. So to sum it all up, defining whether an exercise is a knee or hip dominant has to do with the amount of knee extension resistance there is compared to, or in relation to, the amount of hip extension resistance there is. So a more forward-leaning style with less knee travel is more hip dominant, and a more knee forward vertical torso type style, like you would see in a pistol or a front squat or a wall ball, is a more knee dominant exercise.